I have told this story only once before to my youngest son on the night before his own wedding. He sat across from me at the library table in the hour after the house had gone quiet, and he asked me, as young men on the eve of their wedding sometimes do, whether I had ever known fear, not the fear of a battlefield or a bad debt, the deeper kind, the fear of being seen. I told him yes. I told him about his mother. I was the most ruthless man in 3 counties on the morning I entered Aldwych. That is not self-flattery. It is a reputation I had cultivated with deliberate care across 15 years, because a duke who is feared is a duke who is left in peace, and peace was the only thing I had wanted since grief had taken my first wife and left me with a house too large and a silence too vast to ever properly fill. I governed my estate with precision. I kept my accounts in perfect order. I attended the required functions of society with a face that gave nothing away, and I returned home relieved each time. I did not look for tenderness. I was not, I had decided, the sort of man who deserved it twice. My business in Aldwych was a creditor's matter, dull, routine, the kind of thing my solicitor ought to have handled but could not, because the party in question had insisted on my personal attention. Lord Aldrich Voss had owed the Veldenmere estate a substantial sum since a foolish land speculation 3 years prior, and my patience had finally exhausted itself. I rode in on a cold Tuesday in late October with my steward Henwick beside me, and no particular expectation, beyond collecting what was owed and leaving before nightfall. What I found was not what I had expected. The Voss creditors' gathering was held in the upper hall of the Black Anchor Inn, a room that smelled of tallow and damp wool, and the particular sourness of men who are owed money and intend to collect it. There were perhaps a dozen of us. Voss himself stood near the fireplace, a man who had once been prosperous and now wore that prosperity like a coat that no longer fit, a little too wide in the shoulder, a little too short in the sleeve. He had the florid face of a man who had drunk away his luck and the darting eyes of one who knew it. He was not the reason I stayed. When the door at the far end of the hall opened, I was already preparing to be bored. Then the girl walked in. I say girl, she was not a girl. She was perhaps 23, dressed in a gray wool gown that had been mended at the cuff and pressed with care, her dark hair drawn up simply, her expression composed in the way that people are composed when they have decided, some hours earlier, that they will not weep in public regardless of what happens next. She walked the length of that room as though it were a garden path and the men watching her were merely the hedgerows, and she took her place beside a tall-backed chair near her father without looking at any of us directly. She did not look at him either. She looked at a point somewhere above the fireplace and kept her chin level and her hands quiet at her sides. I had been in that room for 40 minutes. It was the first interesting thing I had seen. I want to be clear about what I mean by interesting, because I am aware it sounds insufficient. I mean that she had the quality, rare enough in any room, rarer still in a creditor's hall, of being entirely herself in a circumstance designed to unmake her. Most people, when placed in a situation that demeans them, either collapse into the demeaning or perform resistance to it. She did neither. She simply stood there and was a Lara, and the room, with all its sourness and its appetite, could not touch that. Voss cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am aware I cannot meet the full balance of what is owed in currency. I have, however," he paused as one pauses before saying something that ought to shame him, but does not quite, because shame requires a residue of self-respect he had long since spent, "a proposal of settlement that several of you have found agreeable in principle." He was, in the plain language stripped of his circling preamble, auctioning his daughter's hand. She did not flinch. That was the first thing I marked. Every man in that room glanced at her face, the way men do when they expect a spectacle of distress, and she gave them nothing. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not move. She stood where she had been placed, and she breathed steadily, and she looked at the point above the fireplace, and I thought, This woman has been told what is happening. She had prepared herself. Whatever she felt, and she must have felt something, because she was a human being and her father was selling her in a creditor's hall, she had decided she would not perform it for strangers. I found myself watching her more carefully than I had watched anything in several years. The bidding was brief and ugly. Two of the men bid with the blunt efficiency of men who had seen livestock sold at market. A third, younger man, Fenwick Crabbe, the son of a wool merchant from the South Valley, with a round face and a proprietary way of looking at her, bid with something more than efficiency. He bid with appetite. He would win at the current pace. He was already smiling, that sideways, comfortable smile of a man who has convinced himself that wanting something confers a right to it. Something settled in me. Not warmth, I want to be precise about this, because what I felt in that moment was not yet tenderness. It was something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have watched something wrong unfolding and you have reached the point of deciding whether to walk past it or stop it. I have walked past a great many things in my life that I should not have walked past, and I have been a colder man than I needed to be, and I am not proud of all of it. But I have also, occasionally, done the right thing, and sometimes the right thing announces itself with a simplicity that makes all the complicated positions you have maintained feel foolish. The right thing was plain enough. I stopped it. Double, I said. My voice in that room was what it had always been, quiet, flat, and final. The bidding stopped. Several men turned. Crabbe turned. Even Voss turned, and his expression moved through surprise and then into something closer to relief, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. He would sleep easily tonight. He had settled his debt and handed off the woman who had been standing beside him like a fixed cost in his accounts. The girl turned too. It was the first time she looked directly at anything in that room. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark brown and clear, and she looked at me the way a person looks when they are trying to determine whether they have been rescued or merely transferred to a different kind of trouble. It was an intelligent look. It was also, beneath the composure, frightened, not wildly, not theatrically, but in the way of someone who has run all the calculations and finds the result uncertain. She did not know me. She had heard of me, probably. The Duke of Veldenmere's reputation runs ahead of him in most rooms, and whatever she had heard had not been particularly reassuring. I held her gaze. I did not smile, because I am not a man who smiles easily, and a smile in that moment would have been a lie dressed up as reassurance. But I kept my eyes on hers until the fear in them shifted into something that was at least willing to wait and see. This, I said to the room at large, not breaking her gaze, concludes. Henwick handled the paperwork. I walked to where the girl stood and I said, quietly enough that it was only for her, I am Caspian Aldrich. I hold your father's debt. I am not bringing you to Veldenmere as property. I am removing you from this room because no one should be sold in a wool merchant's hall, whatever her father has done. Whether you come with me or not is your choice. But if you do, I will treat you with the respect due a gentlewoman, and you will want for nothing. She looked at me for a long moment. The composure did not break. Then she said, in a voice that was steady and quiet and had a faint trace of something dry in it that I had not expected, "You are the most ruthless duke in 3 counties. That is my reputation, yes. And you are offering me a choice." I am. She considered this. Then, that is more than anyone else in this room has done. A pause that held several calculations I could not read. My name is Ilara Voss. I will come with you. She did not look at her father as we left. I had not thought she would. The road to Veldenmere was 4 hours north through moorland that grew steadily wilder and stiller as the light came down, the hills turning from brown to the particular dark purple of autumn's end, the sky over the edge of the moor the color of cold pewter. I rode and Ilara sat in the coach, and I did not speak to her except at the inn where we stopped to change horses, where I asked if she had eaten and she said no, and I arranged for bread and soup and a fire in a private sitting room and sat across from her while she ate. She ate with a hunger she did not try to hide, which I found, unexpectedly, moving, not because the hunger was pathetic, but because she did not conceal it, did not perform delicacy for my benefit, simply sat down and ate like a woman who had not eaten today and intended to be honest about that. "How long have you known," I asked, "about the arrangement?" "4 days," she said without stopping eating. "He told me on Friday." "And before that?" I knew something was wrong. He had been, she considered her word, quiet, the wrong kind of quiet, and 2 of the servants had gone. "And you stayed?" She looked up from her soup. "Where would I have gone?" I had no good answer for that, so I said nothing, and she finished her soup and the bread, and we returned to the road, and I thought for the remaining 2 hours through the dark about that question and the calm with which she had asked it. Where would I have gone? Not a complaint, not a performance of suffering, simply the plain truth of a young woman with no money and no house and a father who had been quietly losing both for years. She had seen it coming. She had stayed because there was nowhere to go. And then she had walked into that room and kept her chin level, and she had looked at me with that calculating, waiting look when I bid, and she had decided, with the limited information available, to come with a stranger to an estate she had never seen. She had more courage than half the men I knew. When we arrived at Veldenmere in the dark, the house was lit along the lower windows, a warm amber glow against the cold stone of the facade. Ilara looked at it from the coach window without saying anything, but I saw her expression, the faintest movement of something that might have been relief at the warmth, swallowed quickly back into composure. "The house is large." "I know it is large. I have lived in it long enough to be accustomed to the scale of it, but I saw it through her eyes for a moment as the carriage drew under the portico, the stone columns and the high carved entrance and the windows marching away on either side, and I thought, she has come from a creditor's hall in a life that was losing its furnishings slowly for years, and now she is standing in front of this. I wondered briefly whether it was too much. Whether the sheer weight of Veldenmere would feel like a second kind of auction, a different kind of overwhelming. She descended from the carriage and stood on the steps and looked up at the facade for a long moment. Then she said quietly, as though to herself, "It has good bones." I discovered I had been holding a breath I did not know I had been holding. "It does," I said. She nodded once, as though this settled something, and went inside. Mrs. Carr, my housekeeper, had been briefed and received Ilara with the formal courtesy she extended to every guest of standing. Ilara thanked her by name within the first 5 minutes, having asked for it, and used it deliberately, and Mrs. Carr's expression shifted almost imperceptibly from professional neutrality to something more genuine. It was a small thing. I noticed it. I showed Ilara the east wing rooms I had arranged for her, a bedroom and a small sitting room with a window that faced the moor, and told her she was free to use the library, the morning room, and the grounds as she wished. I told her that we would need to discuss the terms of our arrangement in the morning when she had slept. She nodded. Then she said, "Your Grace." "Yes." "The arrangement you intend, do you mean a formal contract, a marriage?" "That is the conventional settlement for what was begun in Aldwych, unless you have a strong objection." "I have several," she said, without heat. "I will present them in the morning as you suggest, when I have had time to think clearly." It was not what I had expected. Most people, most anyone, confronted with the Duke of Veldenmere in his own house, did not announce that they had objections. They deferred, or they flattered, or they agreed. She did neither. She looked at me across the corridor with those clear dark eyes and told me she had several objections and would present them when she had slept. I went to bed that night and found, for the first time in years, that I was thinking about something other than the estate. In the morning she presented her objections. We sat in the library. I had ordered coffee because I suspected she would want it, and she accepted it without comment, as though she had expected nothing less. and she laid her concerns out with the precision of someone who had spent the 4-hour coach ride composing them. There was something both formal and utterly unaffected about it. She held her cup in both hands and she looked at me directly, and she spoke as though the difference in our stations was a fact of geography and not a reason for her to diminish herself. "First," she said, "I will not be an ornament. If I am to be your wife in any real sense of the word, I will have responsibilities and a sphere of influence within this household, not merely a title and an allowance." "Agreed," I said. She blinked, recovered. "Second, I will not pretend to feelings I do not have, and I will not expect you to pretend to feelings you do not have. If this begins as a contract, it should be an honest one." "Also agreed." A pause. "Third, my father's debts are his. I will not spend whatever years we have together under the shadow of an obligation I did not incur. If you have settled his debt, that is between you and him. I am not a payment." This third one was the one that mattered most to her. I could hear it in the way the words came slightly slower, slightly more weighted. She had arrived at it last because she had been building the courage to say it, and she had said it, and now she was looking at me with that waiting expression again. The one that was neither fear nor certainty but somewhere in between. The one that calculated probabilities and waited for the numbers to resolve. "You are correct," I said. "You are not a payment. I have already instructed Henwick to reclassify the Aldwick debt as a separate matter from our arrangement. The two are not connected. Whatever happens between us is not owed to me." She looked at me for a moment that stretched. Then she said quietly, "Why did you bid then?" It was the question I had not fully answered for myself. It sat in the room like a lit candle, patient, unextinguished. "Because," I said, after a pause that was perhaps a beat too long, "the alternative was watching Fenwick Crabbe smile for the rest of the morning." It was not the whole truth. It was the part of the truth I was prepared to give at 7 in the morning in my own library with a woman I had known for less than 12 hours. She seemed to understand this, because she nodded once and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "Then I will stay. For now. And we will see what we make of it." What we made of it in the first weeks was something careful and respectful and charged in ways I was not ready to examine. Alara did not fade into the house. She did not move through the rooms like a guest waiting to be dismissed or a bride waiting to be told what to do. She moved through them the way a woman moves through a space she intends to understand, thoroughly, curiously, with her eyes open. I came around a corner one morning and found her in the lower corridor in conversation with Briggs, the young kitchen girl who had been in tears the previous day after a reprimand from Steward Parch that had gone, in my later judgment, several degrees past fair. Alara was not offering Briggs sympathy in the vague way that visitors offer it, a kind word and a quick exit. She was listening to her with the specific, concentrated attention of someone who intends to act on what they hear. When she saw me, she did not change her expression or excuse herself. She finished listening. She said something quiet that made Briggs straighten fractionally, like a plant moved closer to a window. And then she turned to me. "Your Grace," she said, "a word about Steward Parch when you have a moment." I gave her the moment. What followed was a concise account of Parch's treatment of the lower staff. Not a complaint, not an emotional appeal, but a precise description of 3 specific incidents, presented in order with an assessment of their likely effect on household function if continued. She had evidently been gathering this information with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She ended with, "I thought you should know. I am not certain of your customs here, but I thought you should know." I spoke to Parch that afternoon. I did not tell him how I had come to know. When I came back to the library where Alara was reading that evening, she looked up, and something in my face must have told her because she simply said, "Thank you," and went back to her book. I stood in the doorway rather longer than was necessary before going to my study. The weeks passed. November hardened into December and the more outside Veldenmere turned silver-gray with frost. the sky in the mornings a clean and brilliant blue above the white ground, the afternoons dropping into gray and amber long before supper. The house, which had been large and quiet for many years, was different in ways I had not anticipated. Not loud, Alara was not a loud presence, but inhabited. The room she moved through felt inhabited, as though her attention alone was enough to make them warmer. She had taken up the role of managing the household correspondence, initially because Mrs. Carr had mentioned in passing that the charitable letters had fallen into disarray, and she had offered without fanfare, and then proceeded to bring them to order with a methodical competence that Mrs. Carr eventually described to me as a relief, Your Grace, a genuine relief, the kind one does not expect. She organized the household accounts. She identified 3 areas of unnecessary expenditure and presented me with a summary so clear and unemotional that I gave it to Henwick as an example of how such things ought to be done. Henwick, who had been with the estate for 20 years and did not adapt his opinion of people easily, had begun to address her in the mornings with a respect that was slightly more than professional. I noticed. I did not remark on it. But it was not the competence alone. Anyone competent can manage accounts. What undid me, gradually, was the quality of her attention. She paid attention to everything, not with the avid acquisitiveness of someone cataloging another person's life as entertainment, with genuine interest, the kind that sees the world as full of things worth understanding. She asked me, one evening over dinner, about the history of the eastern pasture land, and I explained it, a drainage dispute settled by my grandfather, and she asked 3 more questions in succession, each one building on the last, each one demonstrating that she had actually listened to the previous answer, until we had been talking for 40 minutes, and the candles had burned down, and I had said more about my grandfather's land management than I had said to any living person in 15 years. She did not flatter me. She was simply genuinely interested. When I finished, she said, "So the resolution held?" And I said yes, it had held, and she nodded with satisfaction as though the resolution of a land dispute settled before her birth was a personal concern she could now rest easy about. I found myself, on those evenings, not wanting to go back to my study. There was an afternoon in the 2nd week when she found the old music room. I had not told her about it. It was at the end of a corridor in the east wing that most guests did not explore. She had been exploring, which was characteristic. I came looking for her when she did not appear at the usual hour for tea, and found the door ajar and heard, before I saw anything, the sound of the old pianoforte being struck once, tentatively, and then a sequence of chords worked out slowly with the careful patience of someone finding a melody by feel. I stood in the doorway. She was seated at the instrument with her back to me, not playing anything composed, simply running her hands across the keys in the exploratory way of someone who has not had access to a piano in some time and is relearning the feel of it. She heard me eventually and stopped. She turned. She did not look embarrassed, but she looked as though she expected to be told to stop. "When did you last play?" I asked. "There was a piano at the Aldwych Lending Library," she said. "I was allowed to use it on Tuesday mornings when no one else wanted the room." A pause. "That was 2 years ago." "This instrument is yours to use," I said, "whenever you wish." She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back to the piano and placed both hands on the keys with a deliberateness that said she was accepting this precisely as it was offered, not as charity, but as a straightforward arrangement, and played a simple chord, and the sound of it filled the old room in a way that made the walls seem to breathe. I went away. I did not need to stay. I had heard what I needed to hear. After that, in the mornings before the household was fully awake, there was music in the east wing corridor. Nothing showy. She was not showy about anything, but there was music, and it moved through the house the way the warmth of a fire moves through a room when you have opened the right door, and I began, each morning, to listen for it. I am not a man who has ever been observed at a keyhole, so I will not describe what I did as hovering. But I will say that on more than one occasion in those early December mornings, I found some errand that required me to pass the East Wing corridor at approximately the same hour, and that the errands on examination were not always urgent. I found that I could tell by what she chose to play something of how she was feeling, or perhaps I was projecting, as one does when one has begun to pay more attention to a person than is strictly necessary. The simpler pieces, worked out slowly with that exploratory patience, seemed to come on the mornings when she was thinking something through. Once, very early, I heard something faster and slightly reckless, a phrase repeated and then lifted into a run that she cut off abruptly, as though she had surprised herself. I stood in the corridor for a moment after it stopped, and I was smiling. I had not been aware I was going to smile. I was becoming a man I barely recognized, and I found to my considerable surprise that I did not mind. The trouble with allowing yourself to feel something is that you cannot selectively allow it. You cannot unlock one small room of yourself and keep all the others sealed. I had learned this once already, when my first wife had died in her confinement, and I had shut the whole house of myself up and told myself it was wisdom. What I had not accounted for was that Ilara Voss was the kind of person who was interested in every room, not invasively, not presumptuously, but the light of her curiosity reached under doors without her trying. She found the portrait of my late wife in the long gallery in the second week and did not pretend she hadn't. She said to me the following morning she had a kind face. That was all. Not a question, not a probe, just a clear, simple observation offered freely, and then silence in which I could say what I wished or say nothing at all. I said nothing for a moment, and then I said, she did, and that was all. But it was the first time in 3 years I had spoken of her to anyone in this house, and I noticed the relief of it, like the first breath after a long time underwater. I had not known I was holding something that could be released. I did not tell Ilara that, not then. What came first was Fenwick Crabbe. He arrived on a Saturday evening in December, 3 weeks after Ilara, accompanying his father to a dinner I had been obliged to host for the valley's principal landowners, a function I endured annually with well-managed resignation. He was 26, well-dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who considers himself charming and has never had that assessment sufficiently challenged. He had lost the Aldwych bidding, and he had not forgiven it, which I understood, because men of his type do not process loss as information. They process it as insult. I watched him at dinner. He placed himself near Ilara, near enough to speak to her across the table without appearing to have arranged it. He managed the arrangement with just enough naturalness to suggest he had practiced it. His first words to her were, "Miss Voss, I did not expect to see you here." Not Duchess, not her formal address. Miss Voss, the name she had come to this house with, the name from before the contract, calculated to remind her and everyone within earshot of the terms under which she had arrived. It was a small cruelty, the kind that is hard to answer directly without seeming aggrieved, which was, of course, its purpose. Ilara set down her fork. She looked at him. She said, in the clearest, most unhurried voice I have ever heard at a dinner table, "You will find, Mr. Crabbe, that the world does not always meet your expectations." And then she picked up her fork again and turned to speak to the gentleman on her left. Half the table heard it. Half the table pretended they had not. I had not yet moved. I had not yet needed to. I watched Crabbe's face, the way the pleasantness on it stiffened slightly, like a mask pulled a fraction too tight, and I made a small internal note. He refilled his wine glass. He attempted, twice more over the course of the evening, to draw Ilara into exchanges designed to diminish her, mentioning once that he had heard Aldwych was a very small market town, as though the smallness of her origin was a wound he could press at the table and watch bleed. Mentioning, another time, that it was remarkable how some women adapted so quickly to good fortune, as though she were performing gratitude for circumstances he considered himself to have been denied. Each time, Alara fielded it with such composed economy that the intended diminishment bounced back and landed on him instead. She did not raise her voice. She did not show irritation. She simply answered with the exact weight the question deserved, which was very little, and moved the conversation onward. The table, by the third course, had begun to watch her with something that resembled admiration. I was proud of her, in a way that surprised me with its intensity. What Crabbe attempted last was not in front of the table, but in the corridor near the library after the port, when the gentlemen had dispersed toward the drawing-room where the ladies waited. I had excused myself to collect a correspondence I needed to give to one of the guests, and I heard the voices before I turned the corner, Alara's first, that quiet, clear voice, and then his, lower, harder. "Alara, come, I beg your pardon." Crabbe, quiet and unpleasant in the way men are unpleasant when they are sure they are not being observed. "You were purchased." "I am simply noting what everyone at that table is already thinking." "Then," Alara said, "everyone at that table is welcome to think it in their own time and say nothing to me about it. The Duke bought you like he buys land, like he bought that drainage ditch on the Aldwych Road." I was already moving down the corridor. "Mr. Crabbe," her voice had not raised, it had not wavered. There was no distress in it, no performance of injury. There was only the particular steel of a woman who has faced worse and chosen, each time, not to flinch. "I have no interest in your assessment of my situation. I suggest you return to the drawing-room. I suggest you remember where you came from." "She came," I said, "from the end of the corridor, from Aldwych, as did I last month. And she has more grace than every man in that room combined, including you at your very best. Go back to the drawing-room, Crabbe. This conversation has concluded." He turned. He saw my face, and the face of the Duke of Veldenmere when he is genuinely displeased is, I have been told, a useful deterrent in its own right without requiring any further explanation. He went. I stood in the corridor with Alara. The lamplight was low, the old wallpaper gold and brown in the half-dark, and she was standing exactly as she had stood in the Aldwych Hall, composed, straight, her hands quiet. But I knew the composure now. I had been watching it for 3 weeks, and I understood it the way you understand the surface of water when you have looked at it long enough to see what is underneath. She was shaken, not broken, not diminished, but shaken in the way that a person is shaken when they have held up under something and then been seen holding up, and the being seen makes it harder, briefly, to continue without feeling something. "Are you all right?" I asked. A pause. "Yes, then thank you." "You had already handled it." "I had," she agreed, "but you came anyway." She looked at me when she said it, not with calculation or performance, just directly. The way she looked at everything when she chose to pay full attention. I had grown familiar with that look over 3 weeks. I had told myself each time that it was simply her manner, that she looked at people this way, that it meant nothing particular about what she thought of me specifically. It had become a less convincing argument with each passing day. Standing in that corridor, I stopped making it. "Alara," I said. "Yes." I did not finish the sentence. I was not ready. I was not yet the kind of man who said what he meant without preparation, and she had 3 weeks in my house, and I had a history of losing what I loved and a very strong instinct to protect what remained of myself. So I said instead, "The guests are waiting," and she said, "Yes, Your Grace," and we went back to the drawing-room, and I spent the rest of the evening watching her from across the room and thinking about all the things I had not said. After the guests had gone and the house had settled, and the last carriage sound had faded into the more dark, I stood for a long time in the library. The fire was low, and the room smelled of beeswax and the faint cold of the night coming through the old window frames, and on the table near the chair where Alara usually sat was a book she had been reading that afternoon, left open at her page. I looked at it for a while. Then I put another log on the fire, as though she were still there and might be cold, and went to bed. December deepened and the moor was white. Christmas approached with the quiet inevitability of season, and the house, my house, which had been for 3 years a machine of perfect order and perfect silence, was, by some alchemy I could not account for, warm. Mrs. Carr had taken to consulting Alara on the household arrangements with a naturalness that suggested she had long since ceased to think of it as an imposition. Briggs, the kitchen girl, had not been reduced to tears again. She had, in fact, taken on a small additional responsibility in the still room that Alara had proposed and I had approved, and she performed it with the careful attention of someone who has been given, for perhaps the first time, a task that assumed their competence. The charitable correspondence was better managed than it had ever been in my tenure. And the tenants at the southern edge of the estate, who had been in a slow dispute with Henwick over drainage rights for months, arrived one morning to find Alara there before them, having walked the disputed field herself in her stoutest boots. I was informed she had borrowed them from the kitchen, and arrived at a proposed resolution she presented to Henwick that afternoon. It was fair. It was also, Henwick admitted to me that evening with the slightly pained expression of a man, acknowledging that someone else has solved a problem he could not, entirely correct. I heard about it from 3 different members of the household before she mentioned it to me. "I hope I didn't overstep," she said, when I finally brought it up over dinner. "The drainage resolution is perfectly sound," I said. "That isn't what I asked." "No," I said, "you didn't overstep." She looked at me across the table, the candlelight between us, and said nothing more. She simply nodded and poured more wine into her glass, and the silence between us was of the kind that does not require filling. I had been sitting in this silence with her more often. I had been seeking it out, if I was honest with myself, which I was beginning to try to be. The night it changed was not dramatic. There was no storm, no crisis, no arrival of a letter containing terrible news. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of December, one of those long winter evenings when the moor outside is absolutely dark, and the house draws in around its own warmth. And we were in the library after supper, and Alara was reading, and I was ostensibly working on correspondence that had been sitting on my desk unfinished for 2 days, because every time I attempted it, I found myself listening for the sound of her turning a page. She turned a page. I looked up. She looked up at precisely the wrong moment and caught me watching. She did not look away, neither did I. "Caspian," she said. She had never called me that before. We had been Your Grace and Miss Voss, or Alara, when I slipped into it, which was more and more often, but never the given name, never the one my late wife had used, never the one my mother had called me in the nursery, never the one that meant, "I am speaking to you and not to your title." "Yes," I said. "I have been thinking." "About what?" She set her book down. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at me, and what I saw in her face was the same calculation and courage I had first seen in the Aldwych Hall, that particular expression that meant she had been composing something for a while and had now decided to say it, and having decided, would not stop. "When you bid on me," she said, "you said you were not bringing me to Veldenmere as property. You said whether I came was my choice." "I remember. And when you brought me here, you treated me as though that were true, not as a guest, as someone with standing here. You listened to me about Parch. You looked at the accounts. You let me have the music room. She paused, and the composure flickered for just a moment, and under it I saw something I had not let myself name before, something that had been building in the evenings and the silences and the small specific acts of a man who is trying not to love someone and failing. You put a log on the library fire before you went to bed, even when I was not there. I noticed. I had not thought she would notice that. "I want to ask you," she said, carefully, steadily, the way she asked everything when the answer truly mattered, "what this is, because I came here prepared for a contract. I prepared myself for something useful and dignified and decent if I was fortunate. I did not prepare for—" She stopped, started again. "I did not prepare for the possibility that this might be something real, and I need to know if it is, or if I am misreading the room, as I have been known to do." "You have not," I said, "in my observation, ever misread a room in your life." "Caspian." "I know." I put the correspondence down. I turned in my chair to face her fully. In 3 weeks I had not touched her. I had handed her into the coach when we left Aldwych, my hand under hers for a moment on the step, and I had not forgotten the weight of it, but I had not repeated it, because she deserved more than a man taking liberties under the cover of a contract. "I am not easy," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I have been governed deliberately for a long time because the alternative was something I was afraid to risk again. I lost someone. I managed that loss by deciding I was not, afterward, capable of this. I had very nearly convinced myself it was true." She was very still. She was paying attention in the way she paid attention when she meant to remember exactly what was said. "You have made that position," I said, "increasingly difficult to maintain. Since about 7 in the morning on the day after we arrived, when you sat in this room and told me you had objections and laid them out in order and looked at me as though my being a duke was a fact of geography and not a reason to defer." The silence stretched, the fire moved. Outside the moor was silent under snow. "I am not asking you to be easy," she said at last. "I am asking you to be honest with me. That is all I have ever asked." "I am trying," I said, "to tell you that I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment you told me you had several objections and would present them in the morning." She looked at me for a long time. The composure was quite gone now, or rather it had changed into something else, something open and a little stunned and underneath beginning to be warm. Something I recognized because it felt like what I had been carrying for 3 weeks without knowing where to put it. "That is either very romantic," she said slowly, "or a testament to your very low bar." "Ilara." "I'm sorry," the ghost of a smile. "I do that when I'm—" She stopped. She did not finish the sentence because I think she did not need to. "I've been falling in love with you since you put the log on the fire," she said. "That is probably a lower bar than yours." "It isn't," I said. I stood up from my chair. I crossed to where she sat and I took her hand, the right one, both of mine around it, the way you hold something that you are afraid of dropping and have decided you will not drop. She looked up at me and she was not afraid. She was warm and clear and certain, in the way she was certain about things when she had finished calculating them and found the answer she had been hoping for. "I would like," I said, "to speak to you seriously about what we do now." "We are married," she said. "We are married on a contract drawn in a creditor's hall, which is not, I think, what either of us would have chosen if we had been given the freedom to choose. I would like to offer you something different. I would like to marry you as a man who chooses to, not as a man who purchased the right. I would like you to have that from me freely, if you will have it." She looked at me. The smile was fully there now, small and certain and warmer than anything I had seen in that house in years. "You are asking me," she said, "to marry you." "I am." "You are the most ruthless duke in 3 counties." "I am." "And you are—" She paused, and her fingers tightened lightly around mine, "asking me if I will marry you." "I am aware this is becoming circular." "I am aware," she said, "that I said yes approximately 30 seconds ago and you have not noticed yet." I had not. I had been watching her face, the warmth in it, the certainty, and the 30 seconds had not quite registered as time passing. I looked at her now, fully in the firelight, the woman who had stood composed in a cold Aldwych hall and walked the length of it with her chin up, who had presented objections at 7 in the morning with her hands around a coffee cup, who had listened to Briggs with real attention and challenged Parch on behalf of the household's smallest people, and resolved drainage disputes in her stoutest boots, and played the old pianoforte in the early mornings when the house was quiet and found the portrait in the long gallery, and said she had a kind face, and I thought, here is the room I did not know I had left unlocked. "Then yes," I said. You were already told yes. Then twice yes, I said, and she laughed a real laugh, brief and unguarded, the first real laugh I had heard from her, and it was the most valuable thing in that room by a very considerable margin. We were married on the 28th of December in the small stone church at the edge of the moor, the one whose bell could be heard from the library on clear evenings when the wind lay down. I had asked if she wanted something grander, and she had said no. She wanted something true, which was, I had come to understand in the weeks I had known her, exactly the kind of answer Alara gave. The church held perhaps 30 people, the household staff, the tenants, a few neighbors who had come to know her in those December weeks and wished her well with the particular warmth of people who have been treated with consideration and remember it. Mrs. Carr stood in the front pew and cried, quietly and with great dignity, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a certain kind of thing to happen and is glad it has. Briggs stood near the back and looked, for the first time since the autumn, entirely sure that the world was a reasonable place. Henwick, who had been with the estate for 20 years and was not given to sentiment, stood very straight throughout the ceremony and afterward shook my hand with the grip of a man who is communicating something he will not say aloud. I watched Alara walk toward me from the back of that church the way I have watched nothing else in my life, before or since. She wore a deep cream gown she had made with Briggs's help from fabric she had found in the Veldenmere stores, nothing purchased or borrowed from a life she had not chosen, and she walked the way she always walked, with the particular composed steadiness of a woman who has decided exactly where she is going and why, and has no remaining doubts about either. She was not performing anything. She was not playing the Duchess or the grateful rescued woman or the contract bride made good. She was Alara Voss, walking toward me because she had chosen to. When she reached me, I took her hand. She looked up at me with those clear dark eyes, and I felt, not for the first time, but with a new and absolute certainty, that every act of iron discipline in my life before this morning had simply been holding the door shut until she arrived to open it properly. The vicar said the words. We said our words. I had written my own vow the night before, sitting alone in the library, and it had taken me 3 attempts and a great deal of crossed-out paper to say what I meant without the words sounding borrowed or formal. What I finally said was very simple. I told her that I had come to Aldwych to collect a debt, and discovered that the only thing I had lacked, in my careful and orderly life, was someone who would tell me when I was wrong and mean it, and someone for whom I would be glad to build a fire. She had laughed, very softly, the contained laugh of someone who does not wish to laugh aloud in a church but cannot help it, and I had felt the warmth of it all the way through. Outside the window the moor lay white and still under a pale winter sky, and the light through the old glass was the color of honey, and the bell rang once when it was done. There were guests for the evening supper, dancing in the old hall that had not seen dancing in years, the household and the tenants together as I had decided they ought to be, because the woman I had just married did not believe in hierarchy for its own sake, and neither, I was discovering, did I, when she was in the room to remind me that hierarchy is a convenience and not a virtue. The dancing was rowdy and genuine and entirely too loud, and Mrs. Carr was persuaded, late in the evening, to perform a reel that was greeted with considerable enthusiasm and several requests for an encore. Briggs danced twice. Henwick danced once, with great seriousness and surprising grace. And there was a moment, late in the night, when the dancing had slowed and the candles had burned toward their ends, and the hall was warm and golden, and a little hazy with the warmth of many bodies, and the cold night kept out, and I found Alara standing at the edge of the floor with her hand in mine, watching the last dancers with the expression she wore when she was content, not ecstatic, not performed, but settled in the deep and specific way of someone who has found the place they were meant to be and knows it. I said her name. She turned to look at me. "You know," I said, "you never told me whether you had any other objections. You said you had several that morning." You only gave me 3. She looked at me for a moment as though she was deciding whether to answer this with irony or sincerity, which was a look I had come to love, because it always resolved in favor of sincerity. The 4th, she said, was that I did not want to be married to someone I did not love. And, she said, I appear to have managed that one rather well on my own. I laughed. I am not, as I have said, a man who laughs easily, but I laughed then, and she smiled at the sound of it. A small, private smile. The one she kept for moments that were real, not the one she wore in public. The one that meant she was glad in the particular uncomplicated way of someone who has come through difficulty and found themselves on the right side of it. And I kept her hand, and we stood together in the warm and candle-lit end of a December that had been, in every possible way, nothing like I had expected. There is a postscript to this story, which I will tell quickly, because it matters to the whole. Fenwick Crabbe returned in the spring. I do not know what he expected to find. Perhaps that the arrangement had soured, that the Voss girl had proven difficult to manage, that he would discover some crack in the facade to press at and feel better about having lost in that Aldwych Hall. What he found was my wife in the garden supervising the planting of a rose garden she had designed from a scheme she'd found in the estate records, in conversation with Henwick, who was addressing her as Your Grace, with the particular warmth of a man who has genuinely revised his opinion of someone, and is glad he had the chance to do it. What he found was a household with more warmth and more order than it had had in years. What he found was me, coming through the garden gate when I saw the carriage arrive, crossing the garden to stand beside Alara before he had descended. He said something, I do not remember what, and I do not think it matters, something intended to be easy and social, carrying the faint undertow of condescension he could not quite suppress. Alara looked at him pleasantly and said, How kind of you to call, Mr. Crabbe. I'm afraid we are very busy this week. Henwick will show you out. Henwick showed him out. She did not look at me as the carriage rolled back through the gate. She was already bent over the rose scheme again, pointing out something to one of the garden boys with the concentrated attention she gave to everything she found worth understanding. I stood where I was for a moment and watched her, the spring light in her dark hair, her hand moving over the paper, the moor green and open beyond the garden wall, and I thought, there it is. There it has always been. The thing I told my son about when he asked me if I had ever known fear. Not the fear of a battlefield or a bad debt, the deeper kind. The fear of being in the presence of something real and choosing, this time, not to walk past it. I sat down beside her on the garden bench. She moved the scheme to make room for me without looking up. I said, You were quite decisive with Crabbe. I have had practice, she said, still not looking up but her mouth curved. Your 4th objection, I said. She looked up now. You managed it well, I said. So did I. She looked at me for a moment with those clear dark eyes, and something passed between us in that look that I will not try to describe precisely, because some things belong to the people who were there and not to the words that come after. Then she turned back to the rose scheme, and her hand found mine on the bench between us and held it, warm and certain. The way she held everything she had decided was worth keeping. I had been the most ruthless man in 3 counties once. I had been the Duke of Veldenmere, feared and alone in a house too large for one, perfectly ordered and perfectly empty. I had gone to Aldwych to collect a debt, and come home with everything I had not known I was missing. My son, on the night before his wedding, listened to all of it. He sat across from me at the library table, and he was quiet for a while after I finished, in the way of young men who are taking something in and testing it against what they already believe, to see if it stands. The fire had burned low. Somewhere in the house, his mother was asleep, and the particular piece of a house with a woman who loves it in it was in every room. Then he said, Did you know when you bid? Did you know what she was going to be to you? I thought about it honestly, the way I have tried since Alara to think about things. I knew, I said, that she was the most interesting thing I had seen in years, and that I was not willing to watch someone else take her out of that room. What if she had refused, he said. What if she had chosen not to come? I had thought about this too in the years since. Then I would have found another way to help her, I said. Put the vase dead aside, sent word, done something useful at a distance. I was not her only option. I chose to make myself an option and let her decide. He turned this over. That's enough to start, he said. It is more than enough, I said. It is, if you are fortunate, all you need. He married his own love the next morning in the church at the edge of the moor, under the same pale northern light, and I stood beside him and held his ring and thought of the December I had stood where he was standing, not yet knowing what the years ahead would hold. The children, the seasons turning, the long easy evenings in the library, the rose garden blooming every June, the music from the East Wing corridor in the early mornings. Alara's hand in mine on the garden bench, and in the church pew, and across the breakfast table on 10,000 ordinary mornings that I had come to understand were not ordinary at all. They are the world. She is the world. I have told this story only once before, to my youngest son, on the night before his wedding. I will tell it again, as many times as anyone asks.